kind of in reverse order. So what I'm going to talk about today, there we go, is the U.S. economy in a global context and the Arizona economy in the U.S. context, and then talk a little bit more about some observations I've had over the recent past. So in terms of the U.S. economy, I want to talk about where we were and sort of then where we are and then where we're going, and a little bit at the end about where I think we should be going as opposed to where we are going. Edmund Burke is one of my favorite people. Edmund Burke was a parliamentarian during the Revolutionary War in Britain, and he was an Irishman, of course. And he supported the American independence movement, which is pretty amazing to do when you're a Brit in Parliament. But this quote, which was later stolen by Santayana, is that those who do not know history are destined to repeat it, and that's the world we live in today. So I won't talk too much about the past, but I want to make a couple of comments. Beginning in the second portion of the term of Paul Volcker as the Federal Reserve Chairman, and then through the beginning portion of the term of Alan Greenspan, we entered a period of time that was referred to by economists as the Great Moderation. It was a period of time, the longest peacetime period, of minor, shallow recessions, largely as a result of constructive, constrained Federal Reserve policy. Now, the second portion of Alan Greenspan's tenure as Federal Reserve policy, he fell off the train. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I think it's because he married Andrea Mitchell, but because he certainly got lost somewhere in there. Mr. Greenspan, in conjunction with a series of federal policies, most notably the federal housing policies and the federal banking policies, essentially forced, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the bank regulators, the housing bubble that we experienced in the mid-2000s. And that ultimately led to cross-collateralization and risks as a result of poor rating agency activity, and that's ultimately what led to the financial crisis. And the way I describe that to people is, everybody was betting on somebody else in that process, and all of a sudden they woke up in 2007 and they said, man, I have no idea what's on my own balance sheet, so how can I have any confidence that you know what's on your balance sheet? So why should I trust you and make you a loan? And that's what caused the liquidity crisis that ultimately triggered the financial crisis. And it was largely because of the counterparty risk and interdependence of all the financial institutions. And it hurt Europe very badly because Europe decided to buy mortgage-backed securities really for the first time, and they bought all the crappy ones. So be careful what markets you're in. There is a saying from my investment past, which is, if you don't understand it, don't buy it. It's a good rule. And Mr. Greenspan's free money helped delay a recession that should have happened sooner than it did, so it was more severe than otherwise would have been. So, a couple facts, right? The cyclical recession that we had was over in 2009. By the middle of 2009, this recession had ended. And the financial crisis was contained really even before that. There was some hangovers, so that Fannie and Freddie out there. We still have a few problems. B of A swallowing countrywide is a problem, and some others. But if the recession is over and the financial crisis is over, why are things so bad? Well, this is the most stagnant recovery we've had since the Great Depression. Again, a recession that was turned into a depression by federal policies. But we are not coming out like we normally would come out, and I think there's some reasons for that. Normally what gets you out of a recession is housing. We don't have any housing. Consumer spending, we don't have consumer spending. And business investment, we don't have business investment because our capacity utilization levels are very low. And we have overhang from the double whammy that's really affecting more the rest of the world, actually, than us right now. The international issues are huge, Europe, and I'll talk about Europe in a little bit, but also the overhanging housing supply, which is a real issue here in Arizona, but we are recovering from that. This is just a bunch of data. You don't have to worry about the data. It's gross domestic product. So it's the growth in the economy measured in terms of change on a quarterly basis. And you can see the green circles. The green circles are recent recessions. This is basically 1970 to 2012 currently. You'll note the big down spike sort of on the left-hand side. That's the Jimmy Carter recession. And then you can see over in the very right-hand side, that's the most recent recession, the 2008-2009 recession. I point them out because they're the deepest, and that's pertinent. But notice how narrow the most recent recession was. We went down and came back out relatively quickly, much like the 2000 recession when the dot-com bubble burst and 9/11 happened. Bounce and bounce right back out. But not nearly as long as the Carter recession. So it took Reagan and Volcker a couple of years to get out of that. So note the difference in our recovery. Recoveries in economics are a little bit like Super Bowl balls. Remember when you were a kid, you had that little round ball and you threw it down and bounced really high, and the harder you threw it, the higher it bounced? Well, typically the deeper you go in a recession, the higher you bounce out of it. And you can see those recessions in the 70s, that was the pattern. And the Volcker-Reagan recovery coming out of the Carter recession was a huge spike going way up there. Look how much lower the pattern has been in recent years, and most particularly in this most recent recession. So now I want to go and just look at that very last period of time. This is 2009 to 2012. This is the end of the recession. You can see the down bar, and then the subsequent recovery. That red line is based upon kind of the long-term average of recoveries, and you can see we are significantly below that line. And here's the real problem. It's actually beginning to go down again. And that, this isn't a double-dip recession because we're out of that. This is a whole new potential risk of recession happening again. And I'm very concerned about that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. This is employment. Same kind of data, growth in employment. You can see the recessions, and you can see the bounce-back recoveries in employment. Note how low we are all the way on that side. On the right-hand side, our bounce back in employment just hasn't been there. You can see that in the job numbers, and I'll talk about that too. So I took the 1981-82 recovery, laid it over the top of our current recovery. That's the bright green line all the way over on the right-hand side. We ought to be up there, and we're not nearly there, and that's because our jobs have not recovered like they should have. This is one of the principal reasons why. This is consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is important because 70% of the U.S. economy, is consumer spending. And when consumers are afraid, they don't spend money. Now, apparently the retailers are hopeful because retail employment is going up. Expected retail employment is going up for this Christmas, bigger than last Christmas, so they're hopeful, but it hasn't translated yet into real spending. And more importantly, again, look at the same pattern, right? There's the Reagan bounce, there's the post-dot-com 9/11 bounce. Big, strong upward movements in consumer confidence, not happening, and in fact, the middle part of this year, consumer confidence has been softening. It bounced up a little bit, frankly unexpected, but it bounced up a little bit this last month, but it's still much lower than it ought to be. We ought to be somewhere about there, and we're way down here. And that explains much of the stagnation or slow recovery we're seeing. So where are we going in the near term? Well, things are bad in Europe. Things are terrible in Europe. The International Labor Organization, which measures labor patterns, says that since 2008, not counting the recession and recovery of employment in that period of time, the Eurozone has lost 3.5 million jobs. Their forecast is that over the next 4 years, they will lose 4.5 million more jobs. That's not a recovery. That's a serious problem. And that's because of multiple problems in Europe. There are challenges in the fiscal system in Europe is basically collapsing. Southern Europe is completely bankrupt and protesting. And if you don't have a job and you get a check from the government, you got lots of time to protest. Anyhow, just wondering about that. If they were all working, they'd be too busy to be protesting. But that's part of the problem, I guess. As I mentioned, weak demand is a huge thing, and we have the fiscal cliff coming in the beginning of next calendar year, and all of those things put together have resulted in huge and crippling, frankly, uncertainty. And uncertainty causes inaction, and inaction causes an economy to stagnate. We have some troubling trends. We have slower income growth. I showed you the patterns there in terms of GDP, same with employment. Employment is stretched out. Employment in this recession is more than double the average term for employment, and our labor force is shrinking. I don't know if I have the slides in here or not, but in August, we added 96,000 jobs in the U.S. economy. 96,000 jobs. And the year-to-date average is 139,000 jobs. But the really scary numbers is in August, we lost 368,000 people from the labor force. 368,000 people stopped looking for work. That's a very bad sign. At the same time, we've seen disability numbers jump up dramatically in the U.S. We now have 11 million people on long-term government disability in the United States. And the thing about federal disability is it's permanent. Once you go on it, you are on it for the rest of your life. So there are 11 million people in America who will never work again. But most importantly, half of those people have joined that disability rank in the last 3 years. That's a huge fundamental change. Charles Murray wrote an entire book about that called Coming Apart that talks about the fundamental change in the workforce. So, some more troubling news as of today. The Business Roundtable, which is a roundtable of CEOs, announced their most recent survey, and their sentiment has moved overwhelmingly negative from a quarter ago. The CFO survey, exactly the same result that came out yesterday. It's the Deloitte survey. It's the same information that was in the B of A Merrill Lynch survey that came out about 7 or 8 days ago. So right now, corporate people are more negative and skeptical than even consumers are, which is troubling. So where are we going? We have, in my view, and Brian Carey, if you all know Brian Carey, he's a lot smarter than I am. He's a lot more optimistic than I am, so I'm kind of thinking about trying to get some of Brian's blood. I'm very deeply concerned about Europe. They have huge structural problems that are probably not soluble for a generation. Japan, one of the other leading trading partners in the world, has huge structural problems. You've all heard that the Japanese are aging as a population. They're not procreating fast enough to keep themselves populated. But they also are one of the most interesting people in the world because they have a very, very high savings rate. Now, there's a lot of high savings rates around the world, particularly countries that have come out of poverty. But the Japanese in particular are unique because almost all of their savings is in Japanese debt, Japanese government bonds. Now, we sell our bonds to the Chinese. We used to, now we sell them to the Fed. But we sell our bonds to other people. In Japan, they sell their bonds to themselves. That's a good thing, right? We all hold their own debt. That's a good thing. That works great so long as your population is young. When your population gets old, they stop being savers and they start being spenders. In other words, they start cashing in their bonds.